Fire Emblem is a series that's been around for several decades and has had many peaks and valleys of quality games. But one of the highest peaks, in my opinion, is that of the Game Boy Advance. This is an era where Nintendo/Intelligent Systems put out 3 high quality games, and maybe the highest quality games of all of Fire Emblem. That includes the Binding Blade, the Blank/Blazing Blade, and of course, Sacred Stones. And not only were these games amazing, but they also set a new standard for the series going forward. So today, I would like to just reflect and reminisce on these 3 champions of the industry, and just talk a little bit more about what made them great, from the quality of life changes to the story and characters and their designs and just the overall aesthetic, and of course the music. I'm going to talk about just a little bit about every single thing that I love about these games and why I think this is the undisputed peak of the franchise. I am also a huge Game Boy Advance aesthetic fan in general, so start your bias counter right now. Before the Game Boy Advance, Fire Emblem was definitely considered a successful series in Japan, but it was also not without its own little bits of controversy and just some lower overall sales in general. I think this led to Intelligent Systems somewhat needing to just restart the franchise a little bit, and what better way than to start with the Binding Blade. This is somewhat of a reimagining in a way of the very first Fire Emblem game, with our new starring leading man, Roy the Boy himself. And while Binding Blade is of course a great video game, it doesn't really bring the series back to the peak of its sales. So for the next game, Intelligent Systems did the brave thing and put the series across the seas into the Western world, where Fire Emblem 7, Fire Emblem, Fire Emblem Blazing Blade, whatever you want to call it, did some real numbers. Now, this still was not the best-selling game in the entire series, but I think it definitely proved that these games could sell outside of a Japanese market, and that they did, and that they could have a humongous future for future fans who would adore the series across the world. But why did this series do so well, and why was it such a success to grubby little kids everywhere with the Game Boy Advance? Well, I think one of the reasons for that is just the aesthetic itself, and our main first reason why I really love these games. I think you would be very hard-pressed to find a Fire Emblem fan who does not agree that the animations and the GBA games were some of the best in the entire franchise. And one of the reasons I think a lot of people just look back at these animations or look back at this game's aesthetic and just are in awe. It's just, there's something about them. I don't know if they've really replicated this magnificence ever since. Before this, the games were definitely beautiful and definitely looked cool on the SNES, and well, not really the NES. But I think that especially nowadays, they are a little bit harder to go back into because they definitely have a very 90s anime vibe, unlike these GBA games, which I think hold up to a current standard of what's kind of popular with fans. And while I think you could say the older games had maybe a little bit more realism with their animations, here they went full anime, and I think that's really just a stand-in to say they went all out and they looked so fantastic. And they just have such a cool factor in all 3 of these games. These slow general animations are huge and weighty and powerful, and the quick like Swordmaster animations are fast and cool to look at, along with some amazing sounding sound effects to go with them. And not just the animations of the utmost quality, also just the pacing of the overall gameplay was so much quicker and easier to understand in these Game Boy Advance games. You don't have to do math this time. All the information is right there in front of you, and it just makes these games overall much easier to go back to and play. And go back to and play you will, because these are some of the most replayable games in the entire franchise. Now, I will say Binding Blade has a couple reasons with multiple difficulties, but Fire Emblem 7 has 3 modes and 2 different difficulties. There's so much to explore. To complete this game, it would probably take you a good 100 hours or more. And Sacred Stones, of course, continued that trend with 2 routes for your 2 main characters, as well as multiple difficulties as well, that make, again, these games some of the most replayable and fun to play in the entire franchise. And even if you are going to play your Hector hard mode for the 3rd time, there's still much to explore and new things to try out. You could also try out so many new characters, because usually if you're playing a hard mode game, you're probably not going to use all the characters. So it gives a good reason to just go back and try out a new roster for your main characters to bring you to glory by the end. And even in my most recent lengthy playthrough of Fire Emblem 7, I just found so much even in the story and different maybe side chapters that I had not exactly dissected before. I've learned so much more about the game, and it made me appreciate this game so much more. And one great example of this is Chapter 26X in Fire Emblem 7. Skip a little bit ahead if you don't want to hear any spoilers if you haven't finished this game yet, but this is the chapter where Nino just goes after Sonia, and she's trying to understand a little bit about what's going on. And I don't know, this was a chapter that I remember playing, but I don't think I really dissected what was going on and why we were doing all this. So after playing it a little bit again, I was like, wow, this seems like a pretty critical side chapter to actually see, to fully understand the relationship between these two characters and the depravity that is Sonia herself. So it felt like a very important chapter, and I'm still a little surprised that it was a side chapter. Nonetheless, I still had a lot more appreciation for things like this when I replayed these games. And while on the topic of characters again, we just want to go back to the aesthetics and the character designs themselves, because the character designers for these games were going all out. We have characters like Roy, the fiery little hero in our very first GBA game, to Ephraim, the badass brother of Fire Emblem 8, and of course every Fire Emblem fan's reason for having a massive thigh fetish. The heroes are hero-y and the villains are very villainy. Zephiel, you're still up there as one of the coolest looking villains in the entirety of Fire Emblem, and Nurgle, I might have a little bit less of appreciation for your character's whole story after repeat playthroughs, but damn, your design, it's creepy as hell, dude. And speaking of characters and their stories, the stories in all three of these games are maybe not my personal favorite in the entire franchise, but they are far from the worst and the depravity of Fire Emblem Engage's story or Fire Emblem Fates. Again, Fire Emblem Binding Blade, well, not in English unless you translate it, and of course I was going to do that. It might just be a reimagining of the original Fire Emblem game in its own way with Roy as our leading character, but it definitely has its moments, especially with a character and villain like Zephiel, having some really badass character moments throughout the game. And it's one of the more fun war epics to explore throughout the entire franchise. And Fire Emblem 7 is a little bit more of a personal story about our three main characters as they kind of navigate the world before, Roy eventually everything goes to real shit. As this game definitely feels a little bit more like an adventure to stop a catastrophic world-ending event and less like a war epic like some of the other ones. But when a Fire Emblem game does go this route more so than the war epic, I think it does really allow you to connect to these characters a lot more, as there's some relationships, like the relationship between Eliwood and Hector, that I think really shines for a lot of us. And it also, I would say, gives some of the funniest moments in the franchise that aren't just the levels of a weirdo boob grab kind of anime shit. And of course, there's my personal favorite, and one of my favorite games in the entire franchise, and that is the Sacred Stones. This is a story that is a little bit of a war epic, a little bit of just an adventure to stop a world-ending thing, but for me, Sacred Stones really highlights the main villain and his descent into madness due to his own insecurities, and I think that really shines throughout this story, especially in Ephraim's route, between Leon's relationship with Ephraim and just learning a bit more about how they interact with each other. And Erica's story was the first route that I did, but on repeat playthroughs though, Ephraim's, I do feel like that is kind of the more definitive route. And I love you, Erica, again, and I would like to go talk about a little bit some more negative things, or maybe not the best things about these Game Boy Advance games, because I know some of you in the comments are probably going to point it out. But one last great thing, because you'll probably hear a little bit of it throughout this entire video, but the music, of course, in these games are some of the best in the entire franchise. Not my favorite, but there's of course songs like Together We Ride that seem to just really exemplify the entire series and its greatness in just a couple minutes of bombastic music. But okay, some of the bad. What are we looking at here? I think maybe my most annoying aspect when I went through this game again, especially Fire Emblem 7, although I guess it's probably the same throughout there, is supports. Supports are pretty bad in these games. To get those special character moments between two characters interacting, which is why a lot of newer fans really like these games, is to romance characters. The closest thing in here is our supports, and you only get to level A in most of these, but you gotta just have two characters that just kind of sit next to each other for turns and turns on end. And this is why playing on an emulator might be the way to go for a lot of you. which, you know, playing these games on original hardware, if you haven't already bought the games, can get quite expensive. And Binding Blade, again, you can't even play it in English unless you play through an emulator or some sort of emulation patch. So I do think for a lot of these games, emulation might end up being the way to go, even though I personally love to play these games on the original Game Boy Advances. Playing these games on the original Game Boy Advances on original hardware is both a boon and a bad part of the game. I think they look better if you actually play them on a Game Boy Advance, but you're not going to have speed up. So if you really want to do things like supports, get ready to watch something else in the background, because you're probably going to be grinding those supports for like an extra hour or two in your entire playthrough. And these games are getting a little bit more accessible, but I really hope that all three of these games somehow at least end up on NSO Game Boy Advance. I don't pay for that shit, but I do kind of hope that for newer people that they can get invested in all three of these games instead of just Fire Emblem 7. And while I did mention how these games are extremely replayable, there are some of the beginning portions of the game can be really tedious when you do play through them again, especially if you decide to play through Lens mode. That tutorial is very exhausting for series veterans, I think. So playing it again, it was a little rough to go through those, and I just wish I could fast forward through everything every single time I replay it again. And going on original hardware makes it even worse. Overall, though, this is why I think this era of Fire Emblem is just so amazing. The quality that they were able to put out in just a couple years on one console is just mind-blowing to me. There are only two other times that you could play 3 Fire Emblem games on one console. On the SNES with Fire Emblem 3, 4, and 5. Again, great games, but harder to go back to sometimes, even though Thracia is one of my top 3 Fire Emblem games of all time. And then the other time that this happened was on the 3DS, of course, with Fire Emblem Awakening, Fire Emblem Fates, and Fire Emblem Echoes. Again, pretty good trilogy. If it wasn't for some of the bullshit around Fates, I would say that this is probably also another peak of the franchise. But as I have explained in several other videos, I am a complete Fire Emblem Awakening fanatic. But that is really the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you think if you agree with that Fire Emblem was the best on the Game Boy Advance, or if you think it was one of the other eras. I know everyone really has their own opinions. A lot of it is driven by what was the first Fire Emblem game that really spoke to you, that you played and enjoyed. So I think everyone's going to have a slightly different answer, but I think most of us really hardcore Fire Emblem fans could probably agree that the Game Boy Advance was doing some amazing things for this franchise. Anyways, thanks for watching. Let me know if you like this video. This video was entirely bullet point and not script, so I was just trying something new, and check out my other videos if you enjoyed this one.